idea, plus a lot of drive, and plus a lot of willingness to take risks, then the question is, where does this drive and where does this willingness to take risks come from? And this is, in a way, the heart of the book of Startup Nation, where we try to examine the culture and the history of Israel and try to understand where these two other factors come from. Now, I'll just quickly go through some of the factors that we talk about in the book. One is the fact that Israel itself is a startup. It took a lot of drive and determination and willingness to take risks for Israel as a country to exist, for Israel to be there. The founders of Israel had a dream, and it took a lot of drive and risk-taking to make it happen, and not only to found the country, but to survive over the past 63 years has been a continual challenge and has taken the same kind of things that it takes to do startups. We faced all kinds of adversity. The fact that we're a tiny country, we don't have any resources, we don't have a local market to speak of, we are cut off from the regional market, we've been subject to boycotts, to attacks, all kinds of adversity, lack of water, and so on. And the story of Israel has been one of turning all forms of adversity into a renewable resource of creative energy. Now, one of the big ways we, of course, have dealt with this is through our military. And the military has become a huge part of where all this drive and willingness to take risks comes from, because it's a third experience in Israeli society. Almost all Israelis go to the military, men for 3 years, women for 2 years, and they get an experience that's different from what they get in school and different from what they get at work later on. And what they learn there, and some of them learn a lot about high tech, that's true, but those are in special elite units, and those units produce a lot of the high tech people in Israel. But it's not just about those high-tech units. It's also about regular infantry or artillery or tanks or whatever it is. If you become an officer in the Israeli military, you learn about leadership, you learn about teamwork, you learn about sacrifice, about sacrificing for something larger than yourself. This is not something you normally learn in school, and you don't always learn it in the workplace. But you learn it very much in the military. And most importantly, perhaps, is what a mission is. You know, in school, we don't learn what a mission is. But in the military, that's the main thing that you learn. You learn that a mission is something that must be done no matter what. That you need a lot of determination, that sometimes you need to take risks, that it doesn't matter how many resources you have to deal with what you have and get it done. That's mission orientation. And mission orientation is very important for startups because you need to be very driven. Everybody who's done a startup that you talk to, you will find almost every startup is this close to failure, every successful startup. In fact, I was just on a panel with someone who started an Israeli company to teach English grammar called White Smoke. And sitting next to her, she's the CEO, sitting next to her was one of her investors. And the investor said, I told her it's not working, shut it down. And she said, no, I can make this work. And she was right. And this is what happens all the time with startups, is that it takes a lot of determination, a lot of mission orientation and stubbornness to succeed. Another huge factor is that Israel is a country of immigrants. Almost everybody in Israel immigrated to Israel themselves, or their parents, or their grandparents. So it's a country that has an atmosphere that's very much wrapped up in immigration. And immigrants, as you know, are very driven. When you look at Koreans abroad, you see this. They want to succeed. They're very driven to succeed. They're willing to take risks. They're entrepreneurial. And you see this in Israel. Israel is a country of immigrants, and that very much contributes to the startup mentality. Now, a lot of people ask what other countries can learn from Israel, and this has actually been one of the very exciting parts about the book, that so many countries have translated the book. It's also out in Chinese, both in China and Taiwan. I just launched the book in Brazil in Portuguese. It's out in Russian. It's coming out in German, Italian, and French. It's actually also coming out in Arabic and Turkish, which is very interesting. In total, about 14, 15 languages. And this is not because people are interested in Israel per se. They're interested in where innovation comes from, where startups come from. And I think a lot of people find this frustrating because they think, well, Israel has such strange circumstances. What can we learn from Israel? And the answer is yes. I mean, there obviously are very many unique circumstances to Israel. But every country is unique. Every country has its unique circumstances. There's still a lot of lessons, I think, that can be learned. And the lessons fall into two categories. One is on a kind of a national level, and the other is inside companies. But I just want a general point about these lessons is that a lot of it has to do with removing obstacles because, you know, as I've said, it's so tough to be an entrepreneur, to do startups. A lot of the trick is making it easier for them, is to understand what their difficulties are in terms of any sort of obstacles and, when possible, remove those obstacles. A lot of countries and a lot of people think, what can we do to produce more innovation? Well, often it's removing obstacles rather than giving assistance. The best and often most important form of assistance is actually removing obstacles. Now, in terms of inside companies, we can get back later to the question of national policy, but I'm struck by these incredible books that I'm sure many of you have read in Korean that have studied the most successful big companies in history, in search of excellence, built to last, good to great. And reading these books, if you read them with an eye, with a Startup Nation eye, you will see all kinds of lessons that show that these great companies are in many ways like startups inside. And for example, and this comes from these books, the great companies reduce communication barriers. You know, there is an example, I think, from 3M, one of the most innovative companies. Instead of, they purposefully installed escalators in their buildings, so rather than elevators, so that people would see each other as they're going between floors and maybe communicate some more. There's all kinds of ways that the great companies have tried to break down communication barriers inside the company. Reducing hierarchy. How do you get that communication to go all the way from the top to the bottom all the time and in both directions? Motivated by vision. Startups are very much about vision and mission because it's so hard to do startups. It's always easier to get a job in a big company than it is to do a startup. So you have to be motivated by something else than just getting a good job. And part of that motivation tends to be mission, tends to be purpose, a vision. And the great companies are also motivated by vision, by mission, by purpose. They also, compared to the companies that are not doing so great, the people who work in the great companies, they understand what the mission of the company is, what the vision is, and you know, the books like Good to Great and so on talk a lot about how to develop a vision, what a vision is, and how important it is for the company. Another huge part is encouraging experimentation and debate. We heard this in the story of Fraud Sciences, how debate and encouraging questioning is so important. Startups are very good at this, and bigger companies have more of a problem because it tends to be more bureaucratic. And the last thing is adversity. one of the things you see in these books about big companies is that these great companies often have had to deal with very serious adversity. Some of them have almost gone out of business. Even companies like IBM have had tremendous difficulties over the years, and they've overcome that adversity. And a lot of the great companies, even when they're not under adversity, they generate it on purpose. They generate a culture where they're always challenging themselves. It doesn't matter if they're already number one in the industry, it's never good enough. And that's another feature of these great companies. This is from these books, that all of the good to great companies had a penchant for intense dialogue, loud debate, heated discussions, and healthy conflict were common in these companies. And you'll see this throughout Startup Nation about how, there's a great little story about Intel in Israel, where the executive from Intel came to Israel to see, and he was outside of a conference room where they were having a meeting, and he could see in the conference room they were yelling and screaming very loud, and they come out and he asked them, well, what happened? And he thought there was some problem. And the person coming out said, no, there was no problem. We just had a good discussion. And that's the style in Israel. It's sometimes difficult for people from other countries to understand, but it means that there's more debate. Another thing is that leadership is about creating a climate where truth is heard and brutal facts are confronted, and that autopsies without blame. That means, when you read the book, you'll see about how the Air Force works, the Israeli Air Force, and all the elite units in the military have a very good system for any time they do anything, they investigate afterwards, whether they succeeded, whether they failed. And it's very important that every pilot, that everybody in the mission is able to criticize themselves, to say what they did wrong, how they could do better, and talk about what each other did without too much blame, but just solving the problem, focusing on how to do better next time. And finally, every good to great company faced adversity and hit the reality of their situation head on. Again, it's facing hard truths and not hiding them, confronting them. Now, on the plane on the way here, I read an article about inside Apple, just one country, of course, we're all very interested in. Now, Apple, of course, is in some ways different than almost every other company, even big companies. But I was struck by this article in Fortune magazine. You should get it. It's called Inside Apple. And it says that Apple is like a cutting-edge startup inside. They talked to many, many people who worked at Apple and so on, tried to understand how it works. First of all, they have a culture of responsibility. They have a concept called DRI. Everything they're doing has a DRI, which is a directly responsible individual. You always know, whatever project is going on in the company, who's responsible. Second, they're able to make very quick corrections, constant, instantaneous course correction. This is also typical of startups. Startups are constantly changing their direction. Most startups start with one idea, and if they succeed, it's usually with a completely different idea than the one they started with. So you have to have this ability to, on the one hand, be very stubborn about your idea. On the other hand, know when to change. And that's, I don't know that's one of the huge secrets of startups that it's very hard to describe how to do. The less hierarchy. Everybody knows what Steve wants. Steve Jobs, of course. I mean, even though it's a huge company, they're very good at communicating down all the way, every week, every day, and everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing, what the mission of the company is at that moment. And so basically what they've been able to do is take a very large company and give it more of a startup where everybody knows what's going on and what they're doing. Another amazing thing, I mean, Apple has something like $66 billion of cash. They're not exactly poor. and yet they've managed to, inside the company, create an atmosphere of scarce resources.